Welcome to this next thrilling installment of the Boring Files. If you enjoy what we do here, making the world's dullest topics somehow even duller, be sure to like this video and subscribe. And while you're at it, leave a comment. It's not like you had exciting evening plans anyway. Tonight's topic is so exhilarating, so dangerously edge-of-your-seat exciting, that you'll almost certainly be asleep before we finish the first recipe. When most people imagine medieval food, they think of banquet tables, golden goblets, and giant roasted animals. This was almost never the case. For the average person, dinner looked less like a feast and more like a bowl of hot grey mush, sometimes with a pea in it. If you were lucky, recipes from the Middle Ages were rarely written with accuracy. Many instructions can be summarized as boil it until you're sure it's dead, and then boil it some more. Cooking times were vague, measurements were imprecise, and food safety was an unfamiliar concept. One manuscript simply says, add what you have. I don't know about you, but I find that just inspiring. Over the next 2 hours, we'll walk you through 9 exhaustive sections, each one filled with 30 forgotten recipes. Some are boring, some are revolting, a few are both. All of them prove one important truth. If you ever build a time machine, don't use it to go back for dinner. So tuck yourself in, relax, and prepare for the culinary adventure nobody asked for. Part 1. Setting the table. Most of what we know about medieval dining comes from exaggeration, paintings of feasts, stories of kings, and records written by people who were nowhere near a peasant's dinner. The reality for most Europeans was far less dramatic. Small homes, smoky hearths, and meals built from whatever grain, root, or scrap of meat happened to be available. Food was not an event. It was survival, and often a very bland version of it. The vast majority of the population never saw a banquet hall, let alone dined in one. They lived in small cottages, single-room homes, or drafty huts where food was practical, repetitive, and almost always the color of damp cardboard. If we are being generous, we can call the daily medieval diet humble. If we are less generous, we can call it a culinary hostage situation. The primary staple was grain, and that grain was recycled into nearly everything. Bread, porridge, and the endlessly referenced dish called pottage. Pottage was essentially a stew, if by stew one means hot liquid with some floating bits of turnip. It was usually thickened with oats or peas and stretched as far as possible to feed entire families. If you are wondering what it tasted like, the answer is exactly what you think hot turnips in water would taste like. For variety, sometimes people added cabbage. Spices, when they appeared, were expensive and rare. Salt was valuable not because it made food taste better, but because it kept meat from rotting quite as quickly. If you were lucky enough to have onions, garlic, or leeks, you used them on everything. Not to elevate flavor, but to cover up the fact that the stew was entering its 3rd day of existence. There are surviving recipes that proudly note the addition of onions, as though this transformed the dish from inedible to slightly less inedible. Meat, the star of most medieval myths, was not a daily occurrence. For peasants, it was almost entirely absent. Chickens were more valuable for their eggs than for their meat. Pigs and cows were too important alive to waste on dinner. The only time the average villager might see meat was during religious festivals, or in the form of salted scraps that had been dried so thoroughly they could also be used as construction materials. A celebratory dish might involve a rabbit if one was caught, but more often than not, meat meant salted fish, and even that was stretching the definition of celebratory. The wealthy did indeed enjoy lavish spreads, but even those were not as enjoyable as films suggest. A roasted swan, for example, was more ornamental than edible. Records describe it being served with its feathers reattached for display, a kind of medieval food taxidermy. Guests applauded, but no one went back for seconds. Peacock was another showpiece dish that looked magnificent, but had the texture of leather boots soaked in vinegar. The nobility ate them anyway because spectacle mattered more than taste, and because nobody wanted to be the one person at the table to admit that the food was awful. So why do we picture medieval life as a perpetual feast? The answer is documentation bias. Nobles had scribes, and scribes wrote about banquets, not about thin grey mush in clay bowls. A lord's feast was worth preserving in ink. A farmer's lunch of yesterday's reheated gruel was not. As a result, our mental picture of medieval eating is skewed heavily toward the rare, expensive, and ostentatious, while the real story is that most people spent their lives chewing through bowls of food so unremarkable that even historians struggle to make it sound interesting. The reality then is less glamorous and more monotonous. Meals were fuel, not entertainment. They were grey, lumpy, and occasionally suspicious. And yet, within this dull landscape, there were recipes so strange, so ill-advised, that they have been quietly forgotten by history, which is exactly what makes them worth revisiting here. Not because they were delicious, but because they remind us that even in the Middle Ages, people sometimes cooked things they immediately regretted. The fact that we know anything about medieval recipes at all is something of a miracle. Or perhaps, depending on your opinion of eel pies and mutton jellies, more of a curse. Unlike modern cookbooks, which spell out every teaspoon and every step, medieval recipes were rarely written for the purpose of clarity. They were more like reminders to the cook who already knew what to do. A medieval recipe might simply read, "Take meat, add spices, boil helpful." Most of the surviving recipes come from manuscripts commissioned by noble households. These were not books meant for peasants. They were prestige items, copied by hand on parchment and decorated with the same care as religious texts. The intention was not always to make food taste better. Sometimes the intention was simply to show that you had access to ingredients like saffron or cinnamon, spices worth their weight in silver, and could afford to have someone write them down for you. In other words, the cookbooks were as much about bragging as they were about cooking. The manuscripts themselves had to endure centuries of less than ideal storage. Many were left in monasteries, where monks copied them in between more important tasks, like making sure the Bible survived. Pages were exposed to damp, rodents, and the occasional candle accident. Entire collections of recipes were lost because a monastery flooded, or because some enterprising mouse found the parchment tastier than the food described on it. What we have now is a fraction of what once existed, and given the content, it is hard to say whether that is a tragedy or a lucky escape. Even when a recipe did survive, it often came with challenges. Ingredients were listed vaguely, if at all. A recipe might say, "Add herbs," leaving the modern reader to wonder, which herbs? How many? Was parsley considered a herb, or just something green to wave over the pot? Measurements were equally unhelpful. You might find instructions to add a good amount, or to boil until it seems right. These were not cookbooks for beginners. They were cookbooks for people who already had servants, which means the details were apparently considered beneath mention. Another difficulty in reconstructing medieval food is the problem of language. The Middle Ages were not known for spelling consistency. Words for ingredients varied by region, by dialect, and sometimes by the mood of the scribe. A fish listed in one recipe might turn out to be an entirely different species when compared across manuscripts. A spice might be recorded with 3 different spellings, all of which look like mistakes, and 2 of which might not even refer to the same plant. Translating medieval recipes is therefore part archaeology, part detective work, and part guessing. Despite these obstacles, a surprising number of recipes did make it through. Collections such as The Forme of Cury in England or Le Viandier in France have been preserved in libraries and studied by historians who, for reasons known only to themselves, decided this was a good use of their time. Thanks to them, we can say with confidence that medieval elites enjoyed such delights as almond milk pottage, eel stews, and pies that contained more spices than meat. The poor, of course, did not get their recipes written down. Their contribution to culinary history exists only as the vague description, a pot of something. It is worth remembering that even when recipes were recorded, they were not necessarily followed. Cooks improvised constantly, depending on what was available. A recipe might call for venison, but unless your lord had been particularly successful at hunting, the dish could just as easily contain mutton or rabbit. In this sense, medieval cookbooks functioned less like strict instructions and more like suggestion boxes. So when we say that medieval recipes survived, we mean that some notes, scribbles, and vague outlines were copied enough times that they eventually landed in a modern archive. They are not reliable guides. They are fragments of a culinary culture that was already inconsistent, preserved by accident, and read today with the same seriousness one might apply to assembling furniture without an instruction manual. And yet, despite their vagueness, these scraps of culinary advice are our main window into what medieval people ate. They are incomplete, frustrating, and occasionally baffling, but they exist. Which means we now have the rare privilege of spending the next several sections talking about food so uninspiring that even the mice who chewed through the original parchment may have had second thoughts. When we say the word kitchen today, people imagine a room with counters, cupboards, and appliances. In the medieval world, a kitchen was simply the place where it was safest to set things on fire. Sometimes this was an attached room in a wealthy household. More often, it was just a hearth in the middle of the floor, smoke drifting upward and out through whatever hole someone remembered to leave in the roof. For peasants, the kitchen was not a separate space. It was the same place where they ate, slept, stored tools, and occasionally kept animals. The cooking area was usually a simple fire pit with a pot hanging from an iron hook. Meals were prepared in that one pot, over that one fire, day after day. This was efficient, if not especially inspiring. The smell of boiled turnips and smoke became the background fragrance of daily life, one that clung to clothing and furniture with remarkable persistence. In larger households, kitchens grew into entire operations. A noble's kitchen could resemble a small factory, staffed by cooks, assistants, and boys assigned to turn spits for hours at a time. Their job was exactly what it sounded like: slowly rotating meat over an open flame until it was done, or until the boy passed out from the heat. Records suggest that this was considered a good entry-level position, which tells you something about medieval career opportunities. Safety was an ongoing issue. Open flames, wooden beams, and a general lack of concern for fireproofing meant kitchens were constant hazards. Many castles and manors eventually built their kitchens in separate buildings, not for convenience, but because it reduced the risk of burning down the rest of the property. Even so, accidents were frequent. A spilled pot of boiling pottage could end dinner and several lives in the same moment. Firefighting methods were limited to shouting, carrying water in buckets, and hoping for the best. Equipment was basic but functional. Pots were made of iron or clay. Knives doubled as general tools and eating utensils. Forks were rare, considered by some a suspicious novelty imported from the East. Wooden spoons and trenchers, flat pieces of stale bread used as plates, were common. These trenchers soaked up grease and gravy during the meal, after which they could be eaten, given to servants, or fed to dogs. In modern terms, this was both a dining accessory and a convenient waste management system. Wealthier kitchens did have more variety: cauldrons, mortar and pestle sets for grinding spices, and even rudimentary ovens. But even here, precision was not part of the process. Heat was measured by holding your hand near the fire and guessing. Cooking times were approximate, with advice like roast until nearly done or boil until it seems ready. These instructions were less scientific method and more educated shrug. In short, a medieval kitchen was not the heart of the home in the cozy modern sense. It was a smoky, hazardous workspace where survival meals were produced with whatever tools happened to be available. Calling it a kitchen might even be too generous. A better phrase would be the least inconvenient place to boil things. With the scene set, it's time to move on to the foods that truly carried medieval life forward. Not the feasts, not the banquets, but the daily staples that filled stomachs whether people enjoyed them or not. The next part of our journey takes us straight into the world of bread, porridge, and the infamous dish of pottage. These were not meals designed to delight. They were meals designed to exist. And yes, we are about to spend an unreasonable amount of time describing bowls of beige mush. Part 2. Bread, porridge and grains. Bread was the cornerstone of medieval diets, but it was rarely the warm golden loaf we imagine. Most bread was coarse, heavy, and filled with grains that today would be reserved for animal feed. Wheat was expensive and often unavailable to peasants, so rye, barley and oats made up the bulk of their bread. The result was a product that was dense enough to double as a blunt weapon. Bakers often mixed in whatever filler was available to stretch supplies further. Peas, beans or chestnuts could end up ground into the dough. In bad years, when crops failed, bakers were known to bulk out bread with straw, chaff, or even ground-up tree bark. These were not experiments in rustic artisanal baking. They were acts of desperation. Eating bark bread was less about enjoying a meal and more about not starving. Quality varied dramatically by social class. Nobles had access to finer white bread, known as manchet, while commoners ate the darker, coarser maslin loaves. This difference was so pronounced that bread itself became a visible marker of status. To be invited to a meal and served white bread was a signal of wealth. To be stuck with rye was, in effect, a polite reminder that you were poor. Bread was also used as a plate. Thick slabs, called trenchers, served as edible dishware. After absorbing the juices and grease from whatever food was placed on them, Trenchers could be eaten by the diner, fed to servants, or tossed to the household dogs. In other words, they were the medieval version of disposable tableware, although less sanitary, less disposable, and significantly less appetizing. Despite these shortcomings, bread remained central because it was filling, relatively cheap, and adaptable. It could be eaten fresh, stale, toasted over a fire, or crumbled into soups to thicken them, but its ubiquity also made it monotonous. For many people, every day of their lives involved chewing through bread that was dense, sour, or questionably flavored. And if you think biting into a slice of modern multigrain bread can be disappointing, imagine the same experience with added grit and the faint taste of sawdust. The medieval diet revolved around bread, not because it was delicious, but because it was possible. In good years, it was dense but edible. In bad years, it was more like survival compressed into loaf form. And yet, this was the foundation upon which all the other foods of the Middle Ages rested. If bread was the foundation of the medieval diet, pottage was the scaffolding that held the entire structure together. It was the one dish you could count on to appear in almost every household, every day, in some form or another. Calling it a recipe is generous. Pottage was less a single dish and more a category of hot liquids in which vegetables, grains, and occasionally something resembling protein were boiled until they reached the consistency of, well, boiled things. The beauty of pottage, if one can call it that, was its flexibility. You could make it with barley, oats, peas, beans, cabbage, onions, or whatever scraps happened to be available that week. The base was usually water, though in wealthier households, broth or ale might be used. Ingredients were tossed in together and left to simmer until edible. The result was a thick stew if you were lucky, and a thin soup if you were not. Most often it fell somewhere in the middle, a sort of lukewarm slurry that filled the stomach without raising the spirits. For peasants, pottage was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. A large pot would sit over the fire, and ingredients were added or removed as the day went on. Leftovers were rarely thrown away. They simply became tomorrow's pottage. This means that no two bowls were quite the same, but most of them managed to achieve the same underwhelming result. Historians sometimes describe this process as perpetual stew, a phrase that sounds much more interesting than the reality of eating reheated cabbage water for the 5th day in a row. The texture of pottage was another variable feature. Depending on how much grain was added, it could be as thin as broth, or so thick it had to be cut with a knife. This was not intentional variety. It was simply what happened when you boiled things without measuring. Recipes, when they exist, give little guidance. One might say, add peas until it looks right, which is not especially useful advice. Medieval cooks were less concerned with precision and more concerned with making sure there was enough to go around. For the wealthy, pottage was not entirely absent. Their versions were richer, made with better grains and flavored with meat, spices, or almond milk. Almond milk was a particular favorite, partly because it gave the illusion of creaminess, and partly because it allowed dishes to be served during fasting periods when dairy was restricted. Noble households elevated pottage with saffron or cinnamon, though the result was still recognizably pottage, just with expensive bits floating in it. For everyone else, however, pottage was the unending chorus line of medieval cuisine. It filled you up, kept you going, and gave you something to complain about. Chroniclers did not waste much ink on describing it, perhaps because there was little to say. It was food in the most technical sense of the word. Nutritious enough to prevent starvation, bland enough to be forgotten immediately after eating. Modern attempts to recreate pottage have not done much to rescue its reputation. Culinary historians have boiled barley, peas, and leeks together and declared the result authentic, which is another way of saying exactly as disappointing as advertised. Tasting notes from these experiments usually include words like earthy, plain, and better with salt. Few people go back for a second bowl, except perhaps out of scholarly obligation. In the end, pottage was not a dish you ate for pleasure. It was a dish you ate because it was there. The medieval world ran on pottage, not because anyone particularly enjoyed it, but because it was endlessly adaptable and relentlessly filling. It is, in many ways, the perfect symbol of medieval life. Practical, monotonous, and just exciting enough to keep you alive without ever being exciting enough to remember. Few foods have carried a reputation as dreary as gruel. Even in its own time, it was the meal people ate when there were no better options, and in the centuries since, its name has become shorthand for misery. Say the word gruel, and no one imagines a banquet. They imagine a bowl of something grey, thin, and unconvincing, and they are not wrong. Gruel was grain boiled in water until the result was a watery slurry that provided calories without excitement. It was cheap, predictable, and efficient, three qualities rarely associated with joy. For medieval peasants, this was its main virtue. It stretched grain farther than bread or pottage, which meant survival during lean times. What it lacked in taste, it made up for in sheer availability. The poor relied on gruel because it stretched small amounts of grain further than bread or pottage. It was especially common for children, the sick, and the elderly, partly because it was easy to digest, and partly because no one else wanted it. Gruel had the consistency of something halfway between soup and regret, which made it perfect for people without teeth or strong opinions. Nobles occasionally ate gruel too, but theirs was dressed up with additions like milk, honey, or spices. These enhancements did not fundamentally change the dish. It was still gruel, just slightly less depressing. Think of it as the medieval version of paying extra for a deluxe option that remains disappointing no matter how much cinnamon you sprinkle on it. Medical texts of the time often recommended gruel as a treatment for various ailments. It was thought to soothe the stomach, calm fevers, and restore balance to the body's humours. In reality, it mostly restored a sense of boredom to the patient, which may have been therapeutic in its own way. At the very least, gruel was unlikely to make anyone feel worse unless they had to eat it for several weeks in a row. Modern recreations of medieval gruel confirm its reputation. Historians who have attempted it describe the flavour as bland, the texture as thin, and the overall experience as something best forgotten immediately afterward. In this sense, gruel is remarkably authentic. Even centuries later, it remains a dish nobody is excited to revisit. In the grand hierarchy of medieval food, gruel sat firmly at the bottom. It filled stomachs but rarely hearts. It was the edible equivalent of lying down on a hard floor, functional, uninspired, and best used only when there were no better options. Special occasions in the medieval calendar called for special food, and bread was no exception. During religious feasts, saints' days, and annual festivals, bakers produced loaves that were meant to feel luxurious. In practice, luxurious often meant denser, sweeter, and more decorated than usual. a kind of medieval fruitcake. And like the modern fruitcake, these breads were more often admired than enjoyed. Festival bread varied by region, but the basic idea was to enrich the dough with whatever rare ingredients were available: honey, dried fruit, nuts, or spices. These additions were expensive, which made the bread more of a status symbol than a culinary treat. A loaf studded with raisins announced that you could afford raisins. It did not guarantee that anyone wanted to eat them once they had been baked into a lump of grain paste that had the consistency of a brick. The problem was not just texture, though texture was certainly an issue. Medieval ovens were uneven, and the enriched doughs baked into loaves that were heavy on the outside and gummy on the inside. Slices could be so thick and chewy that they required effort better suited to carpentry than dining. Guests often nibbled politely, praised the generosity of the host, and then discreetly passed the rest to dogs or servants who were less concerned with subtlety. There were also symbolic breads, made less for eating and more for display. Some were shaped into crosses, animals, or elaborate braids. These looked impressive on a table, but had a tendency to harden into decorations rather than food. Monks occasionally baked bread with patterns stamped into the crust, turning dinner into something halfway between a meal and a sermon. Again, the goal was not delighting the palate, but reminding the eater of their devotion, which may explain why very few festival breads inspired repeat requests. For peasants, festival bread was still a step up from the daily maslin loaf. Sweetened with honey or flavoured with herbs, it at least suggested variety. But even here the excitement was limited. If you only ate coarse rye all year, the sudden appearance of a dense, sticky fruit bread was technically a change, though not necessarily for the better. Children might have enjoyed the rare sweetness, while adults were more likely to view it as a polite obligation, a kind of medieval equivalent of smiling through a relative's experimental casserole at Christmas. Recipes for festival breads survive in manuscripts, often with an air of importance. They call for measurements like a good handful of this, or as much fruit as seems right. The result, predictably, was inconsistent. One baker's festival loaf might be edible, another's might be remembered only because someone chipped a tooth on it. No one wrote down the failures, but given how many modern recreations end up tough and flavourless, we can assume there were plenty. In the end, festival bread filled its role. It was symbolic, filling, and occasionally edible. It marked a holiday, decorated a table, and gave people something new to talk about, usually how hard it was to chew. The fact that few of these recipes survived as everyday staples is not surprising. A tradition can endure even if the bread itself does not. Part 3. Meat on rare occasion. In theory, meat was the most desirable food in medieval Europe. In practice, it was scarce, uneven in quality, and rarely prepared in a way that would appeal to modern palates. For most people, meat was not an everyday food. It was something glimpsed at festivals, tasted on rare occasions, or salted into unrecognizable strips that bore little resemblance to fresh cuts. Peasants seldom had the luxury of regular meat consumption. Pigs and cows were valuable for more than just their flesh. Pigs provided a long-term supply of lard, and cows provided milk and labor. Killing them for a single meal was a decision not taken lightly. Chickens produced eggs, which meant their lives were extended as long as possible. Only surplus animals, or those too old to serve another purpose, ended up in the cooking pot. Even then, the result was less tender roast and more chewy exercise in patience. When meat did appear, preservation was the central challenge. Refrigeration did not exist, and so meat was dried, smoked or salted within an inch of its life. Salted meat was so tough it required long boiling just to make it chewable. Even then, much of the salt remained, giving the final dish a flavor that can best be described as mineral forward. It is no surprise that many medieval recipes call for sauces and spices, not to enhance taste, but to cover up the unpleasant reminder that you were essentially eating boiled brine. Hunting was one way to obtain fresh meat, but here again, reality diverged from myth. Laws restricted hunting rights to nobles, and poaching could carry harsh penalties. A peasant caught chasing deer might find themselves punished more severely than if they had stolen from their neighbor. As a result, wild game was almost exclusively the food of the upper classes, roasted at feasts to demonstrate wealth and privilege. Venison, boar, and swan were eaten more as symbols of status than as meals to be enjoyed. The actual taste of these celebrated animals left much to be desired. Swans were famously tough, more suitable for display than digestion. Peacocks were served with feathers reattached, creating an impressive centerpiece. But diners quickly discovered that the bird was mostly a visual experience. Contemporary accounts hint that the birds tasted dry and stringy, which did not prevent their continued use at banquets. After all, no one wanted to be the guest who pointed out that the showpiece tasted like damp upholstery. For ordinary people, meat usually meant fish, salted pork scraps, or the occasional rabbit. Bones were boiled for broth, marrow was scraped for calories, and nothing was wasted. Head, feet, and organs were all fair game. Offal stews were not delicacies but necessities, stretching limited resources into something that resembled a meal. These practices were born of survival, not culinary curiosity. So while meat held a mythical place in medieval culture, the reality was far less romantic. It was rare, often unpleasant, and frequently eaten in forms most modern diners would decline without hesitation. The medieval dream of meat was closer to theatre than cuisine, impressive to describe, less enjoyable to chew. If meat in general was rare and often disappointing, then offal, the assorted internal organs and less glamorous parts of animals, was the reality most people actually encountered. In a world where nothing was wasted, lungs, livers, stomachs, and other bits found their way into the pot. These dishes were practical, resourceful, and almost universally unpleasant. Boiling was the standard method of preparation, not because it was delicious, but because it was the easiest way to make tough, fibrous organs remotely edible. Sheep's lung, for example, was boiled until it lost any trace of texture, resulting in something spongy enough to absorb liquid but not flavor. Cow's stomach, also called tripe, went into stews after a long simmering process that produced a broth with a smell politely described as memorable. These were not meals designed to inspire joy. They were meals designed to prevent starvation. Recipes for offal often appeared in noble households as well, though framed with a bit more ceremony. A dish of boiled lights, lights being lungs, might be presented with herbs or vinegar. Liver could be stewed with onions, a rare attempt to mask its bitterness. Kidneys, when available, were simmered in ale. But no matter how much ceremony was applied, the underlying truth remained. These were the cast-off parts, dressed up and passed around as though no one would notice. For the poor, organ meats were sometimes the only meat available at all. A butcher might sell them cheaply, or they might be handed out as payment in kind. Families learned to make do, turning heads, feet, and intestines into soups and stews. The results were filling, if not inspiring. Offal dishes provided protein, iron, and calories, which mattered more than taste. Complaints about flavor were secondary to the reality of hunger. The smell of boiling offal must have been a constant feature of medieval towns. Without proper ventilation, kitchens filled with the scent of simmering innards, drifting into nearby streets and clinging to clothing. It is perhaps telling that chroniclers rarely wax poetic about these meals. Banquets were described in detail, but offal stews received little mention, not because they were rare, but because no one wanted to remember them. Modern recreations of these recipes exist, usually in the name of scholarship. Food historians boil tripe or simmer liver stews, and then write reviews that range from interesting to challenging. Few ever call them enjoyable. Even in an age of adventurous eating, boiled sheep's lung does not have many enthusiasts. The fact that medieval people ate it regularly says more about necessity than taste. Offal recipes demonstrate a simple truth about medieval cuisine. Nothing went to waste, even if everyone secretly wished it could. The organs kept people alive, filled pots when better cuts were unavailable, and offered at least the illusion of variety. They were not delicacies. They were survival on a plate, boiled until edible and served without enthusiasm. Few animals looked better on a medieval table than swans and peacocks. They were symbols of wealth, spectacle, and extravagance. Unfortunately, they were also terrible to eat. The more magnificent the bird appeared in its feathers, the less appetizing it became once roasted. This did not stop nobles from insisting on serving them. The point was never taste. The point was to show guests that you could afford a bird no one else wanted. Swan was especially prized as a display piece. Its white feathers were often removed for cooking, only to be stitched or glued back on before being carried into the hall. Imagine the effort involved. Roast the bird, then redress it in its own plumage for presentation. This was less culinary art and more medieval puppetry. Diners were meant to be impressed by the sight, though few records suggest anyone was impressed by the flavor. Descriptions of swan meat range from tough to indistinguishable from leather. Peacock followed a similar path, served with its feathers reattached and sometimes its head propped up to appear lifelike. It became a centerpiece that demanded admiration. Guests clapped, hosts smiled, and then everyone quietly discovered that the bird itself was dry, stringy, and virtually inedible. Even when peacock was seasoned with spices or served in elaborate sauces, it could not escape the fact that it tasted like overcooked upholstery. Still, leaving it untouched was not an option. To refuse was to risk insulting the host, so guests dutifully gnawed on bird jerky while complimenting the presentation. Other unusual birds occasionally joined the banquet lineup. Cranes, herons, and even storks were served to demonstrate variety. These birds were not chosen because they tasted good, but because they were rare. Eating them was less about nourishment and more about broadcasting power. The host could say, in effect, "I can put a stork on the table. What have you done lately?" Cooking methods did little to redeem the situation. Birds were roasted until dry, boiled until tasteless, or covered in sauces so heavy they became more sauce than bird. Recipes suggested cloves, cinnamon, and ginger, expensive spices meant to mask the experience of chewing. This was medieval problem-solving at its finest. If the meat is inedible, bury it under flavors you barely understand. It is easy to imagine how peasants might have viewed these dishes. To them, the sight of a feathered peacock on a noble table must have looked both impressive and absurd. Here was a bird paraded like a trophy, transformed into something no one actually wanted to eat. Meanwhile, the common folk were at home with their pottage, which, while boring, at least didn't require pretending. Modern attempts to replicate these recipes confirm the medieval experience. Swan and peacock, when cooked, are every bit as chewy and unpleasant as described. The feathers remain decorative, the meat remains regrettable, which raises an important point. Sometimes history forgets recipes for good reasons, and few reasons are better than realizing your luxury centerpiece tastes like boiled carpet. Compared to swans and peacocks, hares were at least meant to be eaten. They were smaller, less showy, and far more common across Europe. A hare on the table did not announce wealth or extravagance so much as practicality. Nobles enjoyed them as part of hunting culture, while peasants occasionally trapped or snared them when opportunity allowed. But as with most medieval dishes, the promise of flavor did not always match the reality. Hare meat was lean and gamey, which meant it tended to dry out quickly if roasted. To counter this, cooks relied on sauces. Almost every recipe involving hare comes with instructions for some kind of liquid accompaniment: vinegar-based sauces, wine reductions, or mixtures of blood and spices. These additions were not optional garnishes. They were essential survival strategies for making sure the dish could be chewed without despair. The sauces themselves varied from simple to excessive. Vinegar and herbs could brighten the meat, though the result often tasted more sour than savory. Wealthier households produced elaborate sauces with cinnamon, cloves, ginger, and sugar, masking the meat under layers of imported flavor. The most common preparation, however, was blood-based sauce, thickened with breadcrumbs. The idea was to recycle every part of the animal, while also keeping the hare from tasting too much like, well, hare. The effect was mixed at best. Presentation mattered, especially in noble households. Recipes described laying the hare out whole, sometimes with its head attached, surrounded by sauce in a shallow dish. Guests were expected to carve carefully, dipping pieces into the liquid. The visual was less about elegance and more about proof. The host had hunted, captured, and served a hare, and therefore deserved admiration. Whether the guests admired the taste was another matter entirely. For peasants, hare in sauce was rarer, but not unheard of. A successful trap could provide meat for a family, though without access to exotic spices, their sauces tended to be limited to onions, garlic, and whatever herbs grew nearby. The result was less culinary artistry and more boiled meat with onion water. Still, it was protein, which gave the dish importance even if it lacked refinement. Modern experiments with medieval hare recipes suggest the sauces did their job, but only just. The meat remains dry, the sauces overly heavy, and the combination unbalanced. Food historians often describe the experience as interesting, which is a polite way of saying, you wouldn't serve this twice. In the grand scheme of medieval cooking, hares in sauce sat in the middle tier. They were not as absurd as peacock, not as dreaded as boiled offal, but not exactly enjoyable either. They represented effort, status, and survival all at once. And like much of medieval cuisine, they remind us that the line between feast and disappointment was often much thinner than the sauce itself. And so, the grand parade of medieval meats comes to a close. rare, stringy, oversalted, or boiled into organ soup. If these were the highlights of the medieval table, one can only imagine the lows. Unfortunately, the lows are exactly where we're headed next. Because while meat was scarce, fish was unavoidable. The church insisted on it, calendars demanded it, and medieval cooks had no choice but to serve it, whether anyone wanted it or not. Prepare yourself for the age of Fish Fridays, dried cod you had to hammer before cooking, and pies filled with eels. Part 4. Fish because the church said so. If medieval Europe had one unshakable rule about food, it was this: you were going to eat fish whether you liked it or not. The church dictated the calendar, and the calendar dictated your diet. Fridays were fish days, so were Wednesdays, Saturdays during Lent, and nearly every feast or saint's day that forbade meat. Depending on the year, nearly half of all days required abstinence from meat, which is another way of saying enforced enthusiasm for fish. The problem, of course, was supply. Inland villages did not have easy access to fresh fish, which meant preservation was the only option. Dried, salted, or pickled varieties dominated the table. Stockfish, dried cod imported from the North Sea, became one of the most common staples. Before cooking, stockfish had the texture of wood and needed to be beaten with a mallet until it softened enough to resemble food. Imagine dinner preparation beginning with the instruction, strike the fish until tired. Salted herring was another standard, heavily exported from the Baltic. Herring was preserved in barrels packed so tightly that prying them apart became an activity in itself. By the time they reached inland markets, they were salty, oily, and unmistakable in aroma. Recipes recommended boiling them in ale or wine, which probably helped dull both the flavor and the memory. Fresh fish, when available, varied in quality. Rivers and ponds supplied carp, pike, and eels. Eels in particular became a staple because they thrived in muddy waters and reproduced in baffling numbers. They appeared in pies, stews, and even as roasted skewers. No one pretended they were glamorous, but they were plentiful, and that was enough. Monasteries often kept eel ponds specifically to guarantee a steady supply, though one suspects the monks were not thrilled about their constant menu. For the wealthy, fish dishes became opportunities to show status, just as with meat. Exotic species like sturgeon were prized, and elaborate sauces were devised to disguise the sameness of endless fish days. Almond milk again appeared in recipes, this time poured into fish soups or used to thicken sauces. Spices like saffron, ginger, and pepper added variety, though they could not disguise the underlying truth. Fish is still fish, even if you throw cinnamon at it. Peasants, by contrast, ate what they could find. River fish were roasted on open fires, boiled into thin stews, or simply dried for later. Bones were not always removed, which made eating a careful and sometimes dangerous task. The phrase, choke on a fish bone, was not metaphorical in medieval Europe. It was dinner. The dominance of fish in the medieval calendar created a culture of reluctant acceptance. People endured it because they had to, not because they wanted to. Religious devotion may have been the official explanation, but survival was the practical one. Fish kept people alive during long stretches without meat, even if it left them wishing for anything else. Among all the fish that dominated medieval diets, none was more infamous than stockfish. This was cod that had been dried until it achieved the consistency of lumber. It could be transported across long distances without spoiling, which made it valuable. It could also survive years in storage without changing texture, which made it terrifying. Stockfish was not food in the modern sense. It was a survival product that happened to be technically edible once beaten into submission. The preparation process was as laborious as it was uninspiring. Before cooking, stockfish had to be pounded with a mallet to soften the fibers. Contemporary accounts describe cooks hammering away at dried slabs until they splintered, producing shards that could finally be boiled. This was less like preparing dinner and more like carpentry. Some households kept dedicated implements for the task, not knives, but hammers. The very existence of such tools tells you everything you need to know about stockfish. Once broken into manageable pieces, the fish was soaked in water, sometimes for days, to rehydrate it. The smell was not described favorably. After soaking, the softened fish was usually boiled or stewed, sometimes with ale or vinegar in an attempt to make it palatable. Even then, the final product was chewy, bland, and vaguely reminiscent of damp rope. Few diners praised its flavor, but many praised its reliability. In a world without refrigeration, that was enough. Stockfish became a major trade commodity, particularly from the waters of Norway and Iceland. It was shipped in bulk across Europe, feeding cities, monasteries, and armies. For many communities, it was the only consistent source of protein during fasting days. Its importance was so great that entire economies relied on it, even as individuals quietly wished they were eating something else. Nobles occasionally dressed stockfish up with sauces. Almond milk, saffron, and ginger might appear in recipes, though these efforts resembled putting perfume on a wet towel. No matter how carefully seasoned, stockfish retained its reputation as a test of endurance rather than a treat. For peasants, seasoning was rarely an option, and the fish was eaten as it was, boiled, battered with hammers, and swallowed with resignation. Modern historians who have attempted to recreate stockfish dishes describe the texture as tough, fibrous, and exhausting to chew. One noted that it required dedicated effort, which is not a phrase often used in praise of food. The nutritional value is undeniable: high in protein, low in fat, durable in storage. But the culinary experience remains closer to punishment than pleasure. In the end, stockfish illustrates the priorities of medieval cooking. Flavor was optional. Durability was mandatory. You did not serve stockfish to impress your guests. You served it because it was still edible after a year in storage, and because hammers were cheaper than fresh fish. Few dishes better capture the oddities of medieval cooking than eel pie. It sounds like a joke, or perhaps a punishment, but for centuries it was a genuine staple. Eels were everywhere in Europe's rivers and marshes, and because they were technically fish, they fit neatly into the endless church rules requiring meatless days. Abundant, cheap, and squirming their way into every waterway, eels became the protein of choice for pies that no one was truly excited to eat. The first challenge was catching them. Eels were slippery, squirming creatures that required traps, nets, or sheer persistence. Once captured, they were chopped into sections and packed into pastry shells. Recipes called for seasoning them with herbs, onions, or vinegar, then baking until the crust was firm. The result was a pie that looked respectable on the outside, but revealed a filling better described as questionable tubes in sauce. For noble households, eel pies became elaborate centerpieces. The eels were layered with expensive spices or combined with other fish to create variety. Almond milk often appeared again, poured over the filling to soften the flavors. Sometimes the pies were molded into decorative shapes, proving that even when the food was unappetizing, presentation mattered. A pie shaped like a castle may have been visually impressive, but it still contained eels. For common households, eel pies were simpler. The crust was thick and coarse, made from rye or barley flour, while the filling was little more than chopped eel boiled with herbs. These pies were filling and nutritious, which explains their popularity despite their obvious shortcomings. Eels provided fat and protein when other meats were restricted, making them a survival food disguised as a treat. The taste was polarizing. Some contemporary records praised eel for its richness, while others compared it to grease with a hint of fish. Modern attempts at reproduction lean heavily toward the latter view. Food historians who have baked eel pies report a strong, oily flavor that clings to the palate. The pastry helps, but only by providing something bland to distract from the filling. Eels were so common in medieval diets that they even appeared in tax records. Rents were sometimes paid in eels, and monasteries counted them among their regular supplies. Entire economies developed around eel fisheries, which meant that eel pies were not just food, but also a symbol of trade and obligation. Still, it is difficult to imagine anyone looking forward to one with excitement. Today, the idea of an eel pie feels almost absurd. Yet in the medieval world, it was practical. The fish were plentiful, the crust extended their shelf life, and the dish met the endless fasting regulations. If no one wrote songs about eel pie, it was not because it was forgotten, but because there are limits to what people are willing to celebrate. There are many medieval dishes that sound unappetizing, but few provoke as much disbelief as fish custards and puddings. Even in their own time, these recipes must have raised eyebrows. Custard, after all, suggests something creamy, sweet, and pleasant. Pudding evokes comfort. Adding fish to either transforms them into something else entirely, a culinary experiment that no one asked for and everyone regretted. The idea stemmed from necessity. Eggs, milk, and meat were often restricted by fasting rules, but fish was allowed, so cooks improvised. If a custard could not be made with cream, it could be made with almond milk. If it needed protein, chopped or ground fish could be added. The result was a dish that satisfied church regulations while simultaneously challenging the limits of human endurance. The recipes that survive describe mixtures of ground fish blended with almonds, breadcrumbs, and spices, baked until set. The texture was dense and uneven, with the fish lending an unmistakable aroma that clashed with any attempt to disguise it. Medieval cooks tried to mask the flavor with ginger, saffron, or sugar, but the underlying truth remained. It was a custard with fish in it. No amount of spice could change that reality. For the wealthy, these dishes were served at feasts as novelties. A fish pudding sprinkled with sugar demonstrated that you had the resources to afford expensive ingredients, even if you lacked the judgment to combine them wisely. For peasants, simplified versions existed, often involving little more than mashed fish and grain boiled together. These were filling but not enjoyable, closer to damp stuffing than anything we might recognize as pudding. Contemporary diners rarely left glowing reviews, though some chroniclers did note their existence without editorial comment, which may have been the politest silence in history. The absence of lavish praise, in a culture where scribes delighted in describing food, speaks volumes. Even among the boldest medieval dishes, fish custards earned little enthusiasm. Modern recreations confirm the suspicion. Food historians who have attempted them report textures ranging from rubbery to paste-like, with flavors that linger longer than anyone would prefer. The verdict is unanimous: edible in theory, regrettable in practice. Fish custards and puddings remain an important reminder of medieval creativity under constraint. When the rules of fasting narrowed the options, cooks experimented in ways that kept food technically acceptable, even if no one wanted seconds. They stand as proof that just because something can be done does not mean it should. With fish pies, puddings, and hammer-worthy cod behind us, one thing becomes clear. The church might have kept people pious, but it didn't keep them happy at dinner. The endless cycle of salted, dried, and disguised seafood was enough to make even porridge look appealing. Which brings us neatly to the next chapter of the medieval menu: vegetables and herbs. Not glamorous, not luxurious, but at least unlikely to smell like damp rope or taste like upholstery. If there was one vegetable that appeared in nearly every medieval recipe, it was the onion. Cabbage had its place, turnips made appearances, but the onion reigned supreme. It was cheap, easy to grow, and available almost everywhere. It also had the distinct advantage of being strong enough in flavor to disguise the taste of whatever unfortunate ingredient it accompanied. In short, onions were the duct tape of medieval cooking. Not glamorous, not elegant, but indispensable. Onions appeared in stews, pottages, sauces, and even as a base for medicinal concoctions. They were boiled with beans to create something edible, roasted to stretch out meat, and fried when cooks wanted to pretend they were being fancy. For poorer households, onions were often the only seasoning available. A pot of barley and cabbage tasted like boiled plant matter. Add onions, and suddenly it tasted like boiled plant matter with ambition. The appeal wasn't just culinary. Onions stored well, which made them practical year-round. Bundled and hung in homes, they kept for months, ready to be thrown into a pot whenever needed. They were also thought to have health benefits, prescribed for coughs, colds, and even as protection against the plague. Carrying an onion around your neck was believed to ward off illness, a strategy that, unsurprisingly, did not revolutionize medieval medicine. Nobles used onions too, though theirs were more likely to be combined with garlic, leeks, and spices. Cookbooks recommended layering them into sauces for roasted meats or pairing them with fish. These dishes often ended up more onion than anything else, but at least the nobility could afford to mask the effect with cinnamon or ginger. Peasants had no such luxury. For them, onion was not a choice, but a constant companion. The downside, of course, was that onions tended to linger. Eating them regularly meant carrying their scent into social gatherings, church services, and bedchambers. There is no evidence that medieval people invented breath mints, but if they had, onion-heavy diets would have ensured brisk sales. Chroniclers sometimes hinted at the smell of common folk, and while hygiene was certainly part of the problem, their reliance on onions cannot have helped. Modern recreations of medieval dishes confirm the central role of onions. Historians who leave them out often remark that the food becomes even less palatable, which is saying something. With them, the meals are still bland, but at least there is a sharpness that distracts from the monotony. The onion was never the star, but it was the supporting actor without which the entire performance fell apart. In the end, onions were not a luxury, but they were essential. They gave medieval food something resembling flavor, provided dubious medical hope, and filled kitchens with their unmistakable scent. Without onions, the Middle Ages would have been even duller, a terrifying thought in itself. Garlic was the ingredient that could turn a pot of barley water into something memorable, though often for the wrong reasons. In a time when food preservation was unreliable and flavors were scarce, garlic offered intensity. It didn't just season meals, it announced itself loudly enough that the eater carried its memory for hours afterward, whether they wanted to or not. Culinary use was straightforward. Garlic went into stews, sauces, and meat dishes, usually pounded with mortar and pestle into a paste. When blended with oil or vinegar, it created a pungent dressing strong enough to overpower nearly anything else in the pot. This was both its strength and its flaw. Garlic made dull food tolerable, but it also made everything taste like garlic. For people used to bland porridges, this was a welcome change. For anyone trying to hold a polite conversation afterward, it was less welcome. Garlic's reputation extended beyond the kitchen. Medieval medical texts recommended it for an astonishing range of ailments. It was prescribed for digestive problems, toothaches, fevers, and even as a treatment for wounds. Physicians praised its hot and dry qualities, claiming it could balance the humors and purify the blood. In practice, it mostly purified the air around the patient by driving everyone else out of the room. Garlic was also believed to ward off evil spirits, which suggests medieval Europe may have been one clove away from solving all of its problems. Nobles, despite their access to finer spices, used garlic as well, though often in more restrained quantities. It appeared in sauces for roasted meats and in recipes combining almonds, vinegar, and garlic paste. These dishes were meant to demonstrate refinement, though one suspects the end result still clung to the palate with the persistence of, well, garlic. Peasants were less restrained. They used garlic liberally, not just for flavor, but for preservation, hoping its intensity might disguise questionable freshness in their stews. The social consequences were obvious. Chroniclers occasionally hinted that garlic-heavy diets made peasants easy to distinguish, not by their clothing, but by their smell. To eat garlic regularly was to carry its presence with you, whether you wanted to or not. In crowded villages and churches, this must have been an unavoidable fact of life. Romantic encounters, one imagines, were either very brief or very forgiving. Modern experiments with medieval recipes confirm garlic's overwhelming role. Historians who follow the old instructions often end up with dishes that taste more like garlic delivery systems than balanced meals. The experience is divisive. Some enjoy the punch, others struggle to notice anything beyond it. In that sense, garlic has remained remarkably consistent over the centuries. Ultimately, garlic in the Middle Ages was more than just seasoning. It was medicine, superstition, and survival tool, a clove that claimed to heal, protect, and preserve, while leaving a trail of unmistakable odor in its wake. For medieval cooks, it was indispensable. For medieval neighbors, it was unavoidable. Medieval cooks were not blind to the fact that much of their food tasted dull. To combat this, they leaned heavily on herbs: sage, dill, parsley, and anything else that could be grown in a small plot or gathered in the wild. The problem was not availability, the problem was effectiveness. No matter how many handfuls of dill you threw into a pot of boiled turnips, the end result still tasted like boiled turnips with dill. Herbs were used in almost everything: pottages, sauces, stews, even drinks. Sage was particularly popular, often recommended for meat dishes or medicinal brews. Dill appeared in fish recipes, its sharp flavor meant to counteract the lingering aroma of salt and oil. Parsley was sprinkled liberally across tables, sometimes raw, sometimes cooked, but always with the same result. It contributed color more than taste. To a hungry medieval diner, the green flecks may have been reassuring. To a modern palate, they did little more than decorate the mush. Medicinal claims added another layer to their importance. Herbs were believed to balance humors, cleanse the body, and prevent disease. Monastic gardens grew them in abundance, prescribing sage for memory, dill for digestion, and parsley for breath. Whether these treatments worked is debatable, but the faith in them was strong. In many cases, herbs were valued as much for the hope they carried as for any actual improvement in the meal. Nobles elevated herbs with imported spices, combining them into sauces that were more complex, if not necessarily more successful. Recipes might call for sage mixed with vinegar, or dill blended into almond milk. These combinations were ambitious, though rarely transformative. At the end of the day, herbs could only do so much. Covering salted stockfish in parsley did not make it fresh. Adding dill to eel pie did not make it desirable. A handful of sage could not turn blood-thickened hair sauce into something you would ask for twice. For peasants, herbs were a matter of availability rather than choice. Whatever grew nearby ended up in the pot. This created variety in theory, but less so in practice. Whether the stew contained sage or parsley, it still tasted mostly of cabbage and grain. The herbs were background notes in a symphony of monotony. Modern attempts to recreate medieval herb-heavy dishes confirm their limitations. Parsley wilts quickly, sage turns bitter when overcooked, and dill overpowers delicate flavors. Not that medieval fish could be called delicate in the first place. Historians who try these recipes usually note that the herbs add freshness, but none go so far as to call the dishes exciting. In the end, medieval herbs mattered more for symbolism than sensation. They suggested care, effort, and even health, but rarely delivered dramatic results. They were the edible equivalent of hope sprinkled into the pot, present, visible, and ultimately powerless against the reality of what lay underneath. Up to this point, we've seen food that was dull, food that was bland, and food that was barely edible. Now we arrive at the category of food that was actively confusing. These were dishes that tried to be impressive, inventive, or even luxurious, but instead left behind recipes that modern readers encounter with disbelief. This part of the menu includes gelatinous meats, questionable custards, and culinary experiments that should have ended at the idea stage. They reveal not only what medieval cooks could do, but also what they probably should not have done. If the earlier sections were about survival and sustenance, this one is about regret, the edible kind. Part 6. Odd and regrettable dishes. Few medieval creations inspire as much bafflement today as meat jellies. The concept sounds like a prank. Boil bones and scraps until gelatin forms, suspend chunks of meat in the wobbling result, and then serve it proudly to guests. Yet for centuries, this was considered both practical and impressive. Practical because it used every part of the animal. Impressive because a shimmering platter of congealed broth apparently counted as elegance. The process began with long boiling. Bones, hooves, and skin were simmered for hours until the liquid thickened with collagen. Into this broth went bits of meat, usually leftovers from larger roasts. Once cooled, the liquid set into a firm, quivering mass. To modern eyes, this looks less like food and more like a science experiment left unattended. To medieval diners, however, it was proof that nothing had gone to waste. Meat jellies were especially popular in noble households. Cookbooks described elaborate versions spiced with cinnamon, cloves or saffron, poured into molds to set into decorative shapes. A molded jelly in the form of a bird or a tower might be carried to the table as a centerpiece. Guests were expected to marvel at the craftsmanship before cautiously sampling the contents. Accounts rarely dwell on whether they enjoyed the taste, which probably says everything. For peasants, simpler versions existed. A pot of boiled bones, cooled overnight, often yielded a layer of gelatinous broth at the top. This was scraped off and eaten cold, sometimes spread on bread. It was filling, if not inspiring, and carried the advantage of providing nutrients otherwise lost in thin stews. Children may have found it novel. Adults likely regarded it as one more way to endure winter. The texture was its defining feature. Meat jellies wobbled. They trembled at the table, quivered on spoons, and defied attempts to look appetizing. Flavor varied depending on the seasoning, but the sensation of chewing cold, set fat was difficult to disguise. Even with saffron or ginger, it remained what it was: boiled animal parts reassembled into a shimmering block. Modern recreations confirm the suspicion that these were dishes admired more than enjoyed. Historians who prepare them note that the flavor is acceptable if eaten warm, but once cooled into jelly, the experience becomes unsettling. The texture dominates, leaving diners uncertain whether they should swallow or simply apologize. In medieval culture, however, appearance mattered. Meat jellies proved that a household had resources to spare and the time to engage in such laborious cooking. They were edible trophies of thrift and status, even if the actual eating left much to be desired. In the long list of forgotten medieval foods, meat jellies stand out because they combined effort, symbolism, and disappointment in equal measure. They were practical, decorative, and memorable, though rarely in a way that made anyone ask for seconds. When people today talk about almond milk, it feels like a modern trend, a plant-based alternative for the health-conscious or lactose intolerant. But the Middle Ages got there first, and not because of dietary fads. Medieval cooks leaned on almond milk because actual milk was unreliable. It spoiled quickly, was restricted on fasting days, and often tasted less like fresh cream and more like barn in a cup. Almond milk, on the other hand, could be stored longer and used in everything, and it was. The process was simple but laborious. Almonds were ground into a paste, mixed with water, and strained through cloth to produce a pale liquid. This substitute was then poured into soups, sauces, and puddings. Cookbooks recommended it constantly, treating it as a near-universal ingredient. If a recipe called for dairy, chances are someone somewhere was making it with almond milk instead. For nobles, almond milk became a status symbol. Almonds were expensive imports, shipped across long trade routes. To use them liberally was to announce wealth. Recipes for almond milk custards, sauces thickened with almonds, and even almond milk pottages filled cookbooks. Guests at noble tables saw almond milk not just as food, but as proof that the host could afford to grind nuts into water for fun. Peasants, by contrast, had little access to almonds. For them, the closest equivalent was watered-down milk from goats or cows, used quickly before it spoiled. Almond milk remained a luxury they might encounter only in monasteries or on rare occasions when charity trickled down. Their diet stayed stubbornly dairy-free, not by choice, but by poverty. The flavor of medieval almond milk was mild, slightly nutty, and entirely forgettable. It blended into whatever dish it accompanied, providing creaminess without character. This was both its strength and its flaw. It worked as a substitute, but it rarely improved anything. A fish stew with almond milk was still a fish stew. A meat jelly set with almonds was still a jelly. The ingredient kept dishes acceptable during fasting days, but no one wrote poetry about it. Medicinal writers praised almond milk for being gentle on the stomach and suitable for invalids. It was recommended for fevers, weak digestion, and even as a strengthening tonic. Whether it achieved any of this is debatable, but at least it was unlikely to make things worse. In that sense, almond milk joined garlic, onions, and other household staples as food that doubled as hopeful medicine. Modern recreations of medieval almond milk confirm its limitations. It is easy enough to make and pleasant enough to drink, but entirely unremarkable. Used in sauces or puddings, it performs its role without distinction. Historians sometimes describe it as inoffensive, which might be the most accurate summary possible. In the end, almond milk was less a revolution than a workaround. It solved problems of spoilage, fasting rules, and limited dairy production, but it did so without excitement. Its modern revival as a trendy health drink might have baffled medieval cooks, who used it not to feel virtuous, but simply to survive their kitchens. If medieval cooks had a favorite solution to bland food, it was pouring wine on it. Wine sauces appear in countless recipes, attached to fish, meat, vegetables, and occasionally dishes that had no business being paired with alcohol at all. To a modern reader, it sounds sophisticated. Roast with a wine reduction. In practice, it was more like culinary triage. When in doubt, drown the food in fermented grapes and hope for the best. The appeal was obvious. Wine was widely available, especially in regions with vineyards, and even mediocre vintages added flavor that simple boiling could not provide. Cooks mixed wine with vinegar, spices, and herbs to create sauces that at least smelled impressive. Poured over salted meat or dried fish, it created the illusion of refinement. Whether the taste matched the presentation is another matter. Nobles elevated wine sauces into a kind of arms race. Recipes called for red, white, or even sweetened wines, spiced with cinnamon, cloves, or ginger. Almond milk sometimes joined the mix, producing a sauce that was half medieval experiment and half liquid confusion. Served at feasts, these sauces disguised the quality of the meat underneath, which was often less than stellar after weeks of preservation. Guests were expected to praise the complex flavors, which in reality meant trying to identify whether the dominant note was vinegar or desperation. For peasants, wine sauces were less common, though not absent. Cheap, sour wine, sometimes barely drinkable, was boiled down with onions or garlic and poured over whatever protein was available. The result was harsh, acidic, and by all accounts memorable in ways no one particularly enjoyed. Still, it offered variety, which was enough to justify its use. Medical writers, never ones to leave food unexamined, also recommended wine sauces. They claimed the acidity cleansed the humours and aided digestion. Perhaps it did, or perhaps it simply forced the body to focus on processing vinegar and cloves instead of the questionable meat underneath. Either way, the association between wine and health gave the sauces added legitimacy. The problem was that wine sauces became a crutch. Nearly everything was cooked in them, to the point where recipes blurred together. Boiled fish in wine, stewed hare in wine, vegetables in wine broth, all began to resemble the same dish after a while. It was variety, by label only. To the medieval diner, this may have seemed acceptable. To the modern palate, it feels like monotony in disguise. Modern recreations of these sauces confirm their limitations. Reduced wine with spices can taste pleasant at first, but when applied to preserved meat or salted fish, the clash becomes obvious. It is one thing to add a splash of red wine to a modern roast. It is another to pour half a bottle over something that has spent a month drying in smoke. In the end, wine sauces were not about elegance. They were about survival, distraction, and a touch of theatricality. They allowed cooks to pretend that the dish on the table was refined, even when everyone present knew it was just salted meat in liquid costume. Eggs seem simple today. You fry them, boil them, scramble them, and move on. In the Middle Ages, however, eggs were anything but straightforward. They were abundant in theory, awkward in practice, and constantly at odds with religious rules. Cooks wanted to use them. The church often said they couldn't, and so recipes are filled with compromises that turned eggs into one of the most confusing ingredients of the era. The first issue was definition. During fasting days, meat was forbidden, but were eggs meat? Depending on the century, the region, and the cleric in charge, the answer shifted. Sometimes eggs were banned outright. Sometimes they were allowed in moderation. Sometimes they were disguised as something else to skirt the rules. Monks became experts in pretending an egg was not an egg, which is less culinary tradition and more ecclesiastical loophole. When eggs were permitted, they appeared in every form imaginable. They were boiled hard, then reboiled to ensure firmness. They were baked into pies, beaten into custards, or added to soups. Noble kitchens experimented with colouring them, stuffing them, and reshaping them into imitations of other foods. One recipe even suggests boiling eggs, removing the yolks, mixing them with spices, and then refilling the shells before serving, a level of effort that probably impressed no one at the table. For peasants, eggs were valuable but limited. Chickens provided a steady supply, though many families preferred to keep the birds for future eggs rather than eat them outright. As a result, eggs became occasional supplements to meals, boiled in stews or baked into breads. They were nutritious and filling, but not central. A single egg might be divided among several people, which turned breakfast into more of a symbolic gesture than a meal. Noble households, on the other hand, turned eggs into spectacle. Feasts might feature enormous omelettes, custards coloured with saffron, or egg-based sauces thickened with almonds. The purpose was less about flavour and more about abundance. Displaying trays of eggs suggested wealth, even if guests were less enthusiastic about actually eating them. As with swans and peacocks, the show mattered more than the taste. The other problem was preservation. Without refrigeration, eggs spoiled quickly. This meant that fresh eggs were a seasonal luxury. During warmer months, households sometimes stored them in ash or brine to extend their lifespan, but the results were inconsistent. A spoiled egg was memorable for all the wrong reasons, which may explain why recipes often called for heavy spices to disguise them. Modern reconstructions of medieval egg dishes are mixed at best. Hard-boiled eggs survive the centuries well enough, but blood-thickened egg custards and saffron-coloured omelettes rarely inspire repeat attempts. Historians who test them often describe the taste as fine or acceptable, which are words rarely associated with success. In the end, eggs in the Middle Ages were less a simple food and more an ongoing puzzle. They were nutritious but unstable, desirable but restricted, adaptable but often unpleasant. The great egg problem was not how to cook them, but how to make them feel like more than an afterthought. After meat jellies, almond milk stews, wine-drowned meats, and eggs disguised as not eggs, it becomes clear that medieval creativity often outpaced medieval taste. These were dishes remembered not for pleasure but for persistence, experiments that survived parchment but not popularity. The next stage of the menu takes us into an even stranger territory, where food and medicine blurred into one. Because in the Middle Ages, the line between dinner and doctor's orders was thin, and sometimes your meal was prescribed as a cure, or your cure served as dinner. Part 7. Medicine as food, and vice versa. In the medieval world, food and medicine often shared the same pot. A stew could be both dinner and treatment, depending on what was thrown into it and which humour was thought to be out of balance. Physicians wrote recipes alongside cooks, prescribing dishes that promised to restore health, calm the body, or at least distract the patient from their symptoms. Whether they worked is debatable. What is certain is that many of these so-called medicinal stews sounded suspiciously like regular food with extra parsley. The guiding principle was the theory of humours. If someone was too hot, they needed cooling foods. If they were too dry, they needed moistening ones. Stews became convenient vehicles for these adjustments. A recipe might call for cooling herbs like dill or parsley, or warming spices like ginger, depending on the diagnosis. In practice, this meant that the same basic pot of beans and barley could be renamed healing stew simply by sprinkling something green into it. Garlic and onions appeared constantly, praised for their supposed ability to cleanse the blood and fortify the body. Leeks, another favourite, were believed to ward off illness and even evil spirits. Meat, when available, was boiled with these vegetables and herbs, creating a broth that served as both sustenance and prescription. For peasants, the distinction hardly mattered. If your only dinner option was leek stew, you might as well call it medicine and hope for the best. Nobles had access to more elaborate medicinal stews. Recipes included almond milk, saffron, cinnamon, and even sugar, intended to soothe the stomach or strengthen the heart. Physicians recommended them to restore vitality after illness or fatigue. In reality, these were often just feasts repackaged as treatments. A nobleman recovering from a fever might be told to eat spiced chicken stew, which conveniently looked very much like spiced chicken stew eaten at banquets. The problem was that these stews rarely cured anything. At best, they provided hydration and calories. At worst, they were so heavily seasoned with garlic, vinegar, or bitter herbs that they added discomfort to illness. Patients endured them because the alternative was no treatment at all, or remedies even less appealing, like drinking boiled urine, which some medical texts also suggested. By comparison, another bowl of leek stew probably seemed merciful. Modern recreations highlight how unremarkable these stews were. Historians who cook them note that the flavors are mild to the point of invisibility, with occasional bursts of garlic or spice. They are edible, filling, and forgettable, which means they may have succeeded in at least one respect, keeping the patient alive long enough for nature to take its course. Medicinal stews remind us that medieval medicine was as much about ritual and reassurance as it was about actual healing. To be given a bowl of hot broth spiced with herbs was to be told, something is being done. Whether or not that something helped was beside the point. Few medieval remedies were as popular or as enjoyable as spiced wine. Unlike leek stew or boiled organs, this was one prescription people rarely argued with. Physicians recommended it for colds, fevers, digestive issues, melancholy, and general weakness. In other words, if something was wrong with you, someone would probably suggest wine. Adding spices gave the treatment an air of sophistication, and so the drink became both medicine and entertainment, a rare combination in the Middle Ages. The preparation was straightforward. Wine, usually red, was gently heated with spices such as cinnamon, cloves, ginger, or nutmeg. Honey or sugar, when available, sweetened the mix. The result was served warm, fragrant, and mildly intoxicating. The warming effect was praised for restoring balance to the body's humors. The intoxicating effect was praised less directly, but surely appreciated. For a patient with a fever or cough, spiced wine provided comfort in ways that no leek broth ever could. Recipes varied widely. Some were simple, calling for nothing more than wine and a pinch of cinnamon. Others resembled complex spice blends with saffron, cardamom, and long pepper added in costly quantities. Nobles competed to outdo one another, serving elaborate mulled wines at feasts under the guise of health. Guests could sip generously without guilt. After all, the doctor practically insisted on it. Peasants rarely enjoyed spiced wine in such abundance, but even modest households might add a clove or two to sour wine, transforming it into something more palatable. The spices covered flaws in the drink, which was useful when the wine had been sitting in barrels longer than anyone wanted to admit. In this sense, spiced wine was both remedy and recycling project. Medical texts praised its supposed benefits. Cinnamon was thought to strengthen the heart, cloves to aid digestion, ginger to warm the body, and saffron to lift the spirits. Whether these effects were real is debatable, but the psychological benefit of drinking something tasty and soothing was undeniable. Compared to the alternative treatments of the time, like bloodletting or plastering wounds with herbs, a mug of hot spiced wine probably felt like luxury. The problem, if it can be called that, was enthusiasm. Patients were advised moderation, but moderation is a flexible concept when the medicine is enjoyable. It is not hard to imagine treatments continuing long after symptoms had subsided. A prescription of 2 cups might stretch into 3 or 4, and soon the patient was less cured than comfortably numb. Modern recreations of medieval spiced wine are far more pleasant than most dishes from the era. Historians describe them as warming, flavorful, and genuinely enjoyable. The only criticism is that after a few cups, one begins to suspect that the health benefits were more about forgetting your illness than actually treating it. In the end, spiced wine succeeded where most medieval medicine failed. It made people feel better, even if only temporarily. It was comfort in a cup, disguised as a cure, and proof that sometimes the best prescription is simply the one people are happy to take. Bread was already the foundation of medieval diets, but it also doubled as medicine. When crushed, soaked, or simply left stale long enough, bread could be repurposed into poultices, pastes or compresses applied to wounds, swellings, or infections. The theory was that bread drew out impurities and encouraged healing. In practice, it mostly drew flies. The preparation was simple. Stale bread was soaked in wine, vinegar or milk, mashed into a paste, and then spread over the affected area. Sometimes herbs or animal fat were mixed in, depending on the ailment. For swelling, warm bread poultices were applied. For fevers, they were cooled first. Physicians recommended them with great confidence, prescribing bread for everything from boils to headaches. Patients complied, perhaps reassured that their dinner leftovers were being put to good use. The line between medicine and food blurred further because poultices were sometimes eaten as well. A recipe might suggest applying bread paste to a wound, then instruct the patient to consume another portion for strength. This created a strange duality. The same soggy lump of bread was both topical ointment and nutritional supplement. Few treatments illustrate the medieval ability to recycle food quite so thoroughly. For nobles, bread poultices could be enriched with saffron, honey, or expensive spices, under the belief that costlier ingredients must surely enhance the cure. A wealthy patient might find themselves bandaged with bread paste that smelled like dessert. Peasants, by contrast, used whatever they had, usually coarse bread soaked in sour wine or water. Both groups ended up with the same result: damp bread clinging stubbornly to skin while doing very little to address the problem. Medical writers praised poultices for their versatility. They were said to reduce swelling, soothe pain, and draw out bad humors. Whether they accomplished any of this is questionable. Modern understanding suggests that warmth and moisture may have provided some comfort, but the bread itself contributed little beyond texture. Still, in an age with few alternatives, even a placebo was welcome. The smell and feel of these treatments must have been distinctive. Imagine lying in bed with patches of wet bread strapped to your body, attracting curious pets and less welcome insects. Family members would have endured the sight and scent with patience, though it is unlikely anyone mistook the process for enjoyable. Modern experiments with bread poultices confirm their limited utility. They can keep wounds moist and warm, but they do not cure infections or speed recovery. Historians who attempt them often note that the main effect is stickiness. The conclusion is obvious. Bread poultices worked best as reassurance, something tangible to apply when no real cure was available. In the end, bread in the Middle Ages was not just food, but a catch-all tool. It filled bellies, served as plates, and occasionally masqueraded as medicine. The poultice may not have healed many wounds, but it demonstrated the medieval determination to make bread do absolutely everything, even if some uses were best left uneaten. After leek stews prescribed for fevers, wine passed off as medicine, and bread pressed into duty as both bandage and snack, it's clear that medieval cures were rarely better than medieval dinners. Food was medicine, medicine was food, and neither was especially effective. The next stage of the menu shifts to something more cheerful, at least in theory. Sweets and drinks offered brief relief from monotony, though in typical medieval fashion, they often managed to disappoint anyway. When it came to sweets, medieval Europe had one reliable option: honey. Sugar was an expensive import, reserved for the wealthy, and even then used sparingly. Honey, on the other hand, could be gathered locally and stored with relative ease. As a result, it became the default sweetener, appearing in sauces, drinks, breads, and desserts. This sounds promising, until you realize that medieval cooks often had no idea when to stop. Honey-glazed meats, sweetened pottages, and thickened sauces. It was poured over fruits, stirred into custards, and spread on bread. Monks brewed honey into mead, a drink that was both intoxicating and sticky. Noble feasts featured elaborate dishes glazed with honey until they gleamed under torchlight. For peasants, honey was less common but still present, especially in regions where beekeeping thrived. A rare drizzle on bread could turn a grey meal into a small celebration. The problem was moderation. Recipes frequently called for honey in quantities that overwhelmed the dish. Meat pies drowned in sweetness, sauces cloyed rather than enhanced, and desserts became dense blocks of sugar substitute. Honey's strong floral flavour dominated everything, which meant that whether you were eating fish, porridge or bread, it often all tasted faintly of the same hive. Medicinal texts praised honey as well, attributing to it the power to heal wounds, soothe throats, and balance humours. Applied to cuts, it may have had some mild antiseptic effect. In drinks, it certainly calmed coughs, though that may have been the mead talking. To medieval thinkers, honey was proof that sweetness was inherently healthy. To modern readers, it looks more like an attempt to make boiled cabbage palatable. For the wealthy, honey also served as display. Golden glazes signaled abundance, and sweetened pastries announced refinement. Some recipes instructed cooks to shape honey-thickened dough into animals or towers, the kind of decorative food no one truly wanted to eat. Guests admired the effort, then politely moved on to something less sticky. Peasants, when they had access to honey, used it sparingly. It sweetened thin gruels or flavoured breads, but rarely in large amounts. Honey was valuable, sometimes even used as payment or barter, which meant it was treated as treasure rather than condiment. For most, dessert remained an occasional luxury, not a daily indulgence. Modern recreations show why honey dominated. It does make food more tolerable, but the excess is unmistakable. A spoonful adds interest, a cup turns stew into syrup. Historians who cook medieval recipes often remark on how overpowering the results are, as though cooks were determined to prove they had honey and weren't afraid to use it. In the end, honey carried medieval Europe's sweet tooth almost single-handedly. It was useful, versatile, and available. But it was also overused to the point of monotony. Honey was dessert not because it was perfect, but because there was nothing else. Pancakes sound like the kind of dish that might offer comfort across the centuries. Soft, warm, perhaps even fluffy. Unfortunately, medieval pancakes were not that dish. They were heavy, eggy, and closer to fried batter than anything we would recognize today. They filled stomachs, but they rarely delighted them. The basic recipe was simple: flour, eggs, and milk or almond milk, beaten together and fried on a griddle or pan. Sometimes spices were added: cinnamon, ginger, or saffron, if the household could afford them. The mixture was poured thinly, creating something closer to a crepe, though without the refinement or consistency. More often than not, the result was uneven. One edge burned, the other undercooked, with a center that clung to the pan. For nobles, pancakes became an opportunity to show off. Recipes recommended drizzling them with honey, sprinkling them with sugar, or layering them into stacks with almonds between each layer. The presentation sounded impressive, but the taste was still dominated by eggs. Guests may have smiled politely while chewing through another round of what was essentially fried custard sheets. For peasants, The recipe was pared down to its essentials. Flour and water alone could make a thin batter, fried in whatever fat was available. These were filling, if not exciting, and often eaten quickly before they hardened into something resembling shingles. Honey, when available, might be added, but more often the pancakes were plain. They served as cheap calories, not treats. Medicinal texts also found uses for pancakes. Some recommended them as restorative foods for the weak, citing their richness in eggs. Others warned against them, claiming they were too heavy for delicate stomachs. Both opinions may have been correct. Depending on how they were cooked, medieval pancakes were either nourishing or indigestible, with little middle ground. The texture was their defining feature. Modern pancakes are soft and springy. Medieval versions were dense and often greasy. They absorbed honey or syrup well, but they also absorbed the oil they were cooked in, which meant they lingered in the stomach long after the meal was over. Descriptions from chroniclers suggest they were appreciated, but not adored. One suspects that much of their reputation came from scarcity. When sweetened foods were rare, even a heavy egg pancake could pass for a treat. Modern attempts to recreate them produce mixed reviews. Historians note that they taste fine when eaten warm with honey, but become unpleasantly rubbery once cooled. The overall impression is that medieval pancakes were serviceable, filling, and forgettable. In the end, these pancakes demonstrate the gap between expectation and reality. The name promises joy. The plate delivers something closer to obligation. They were more egg than cake, more effort than reward. And yet they endured, because sometimes even a disappointing pancake was better than another bowl of gruel. If there was one drink everyone in medieval Europe consumed daily, it was ale or beer, not because they were trying to celebrate, but because water could not be trusted. Rivers and wells were often contaminated with waste, and though no one understood microbes, everyone understood that drinking the wrong water could end badly. Fermented drinks, on the other hand, were safer, mildly alcoholic, filling, and far less likely to make you sick. Ale was the everyday drink of peasants. It was made quickly, with barley, water, and yeast, and consumed within days of brewing. Low in alcohol, it was closer to liquid bread than a beverage in the modern sense. Families brewed it at home, often in small batches, which meant the quality varied wildly. One jug might be pleasant, the next thin and sour. Consistency was not the point. The point was survival, hydration, and a few extra calories. Children drank it too, usually in diluted form. Beer, which contained hops, became more common later in the Middle Ages. Hops added bitterness, but also extended the drink's shelf life, making it more suitable for trade and storage. Monasteries became major centers of brewing, producing beer that was sturdier, more reliable, and by reputation, better tasting than what most peasants could make at home. Drinking beer in a monastery may have been the closest thing medieval Europe had to a craft brewery, minus the tasting flights and rustic decor. For nobles, ale and beer were just as common, though often brewed on a larger scale within estates. They were sometimes flavored with herbs or spices, or mixed with wine to create stronger concoctions. In feasts, they appeared in vast quantities, proof of abundance more than refinement. Guests drank heavily not because the drinks were exceptional, but because they were plentiful and safer than water. Water itself was not absent. People did drink from wells, springs, and rivers, especially in rural areas, but the risk was well known, and those who could avoid it did. Chroniclers occasionally mention outbreaks of sickness traced to bad water, though the details are vague. The general consensus was simple. If you had ale, you drank ale. If you had beer, you drank beer. If you had water, you prayed first. Medicinal texts, of course, weighed in. Ale was praised for strengthening the body, beer for aiding digestion, and both for balancing humours. Some doctors warned against excessive drinking, though moderation was rare at feasts. If you wanted to avoid suspicion of illness, refusing ale or beer outright might even be seen as strange. Modern recreations of medieval ales revealed drinks that were cloudy, yeasty, and less refined than modern versions. They were filling, mildly alcoholic, and surprisingly nutritious, but few tasters described them as refreshing. Instead, they were functional, a way to wash down bread and stew without risking dysentery. In the end, ale and beer were not luxuries, but necessities. They kept people alive, hydrated, and occasionally cheerful. And if the Middle Ages had a collective motto, it might well have been, "Better cloudy ale than clear water." With honey-glazed meats, heavy pancakes, and ale consumed like water because water itself was suspect, medieval attempts at sweetness and refreshment feel more like coping strategies than indulgences. These were not treats in the modern sense, but brief distractions from monotony, sticky, dense, and occasionally dangerous. What remains now is the ending course, the conclusion to a menu that history itself decided not to keep. Here we look back at why these recipes, despite surviving in manuscripts, did not survive on the table. Part 9. Why these recipes stayed forgotten, thankfully. The Middle Ages left us with an impressive number of recipes. They were copied into manuscripts, preserved in libraries, and studied by historians. Yet very few of them survived as living traditions. Unlike roast chicken, fresh bread, or fruit preserves, dishes that evolved and endured, the majority of medieval meals were quietly abandoned. And after examining meat jellies, eel pies, and fish custards, the reasons are obvious. The first is taste. Many dishes simply did not appeal to later generations. Food is always subject to fashion, and what passed for elegant in 1350 might taste ridiculous in 1550. Swans dressed in feathers and pies stuffed with eels were showpieces that impressed on arrival and disappointed on the tongue. When alternatives became available, sugar instead of honey, butter instead of almond milk, fresh meat instead of salted slabs, people moved on quickly, and no one argued to bring the old recipes back. The second is necessity. Much of medieval cooking was born from scarcity. Pottage, gruel, and root stews filled stomachs when nothing else was available. Offal dishes used every part of the animal because wasting food was not an option. Stockfish was hammered into meals because it survived long journeys, not because anyone craved it. Once abundance improved and preservation techniques advanced, these foods lost their purpose. Their disappearance was not neglect but relief. The third reason is presentation. Medieval cooks valued spectacle as much as flavor. Dishes were molded, colored, and disguised. Eggs were reshaped into imitations of themselves. Birds were refeathered for the table. These theatrics made sense in a culture where wealth was displayed through banquets. But when diners later demanded consistency and refinement rather than novelty, such recipes seemed outdated. A pie that looked like a castle might have wowed in the 14th century. By the 16th, it looked more like a waste of pastry. Modern attempts to recreate these foods confirm why history left them behind. At best, They are curiosities, edible time capsules that reveal how people survived, improvised, and occasionally overreached. At worst, they are reminders that desperation, superstition, and poor refrigeration do not combine into enduring cuisine. Historians taste them, write down their impressions, and quietly agree never to make them again. In the end, the forgotten recipes of the Middle Ages survived on parchment, but not on plates. They linger as curiosities, examples of ingenuity and endurance, but also of failure. They remind us that not everything old is worth reviving, and that sometimes the greatest gift history gives us is forgetting what dinner used to taste like. In the end, the forgotten recipes of the Middle Ages survived on parchment, but not on plates. They linger as curiosities, examples of ingenuity and endurance, but also of failure. They remind us that not everything old is worth reviving, and that sometimes the greatest gift history gives us is forgetting what dinner used to taste like. And if you actually made it all the way through this episode of The Boring Files without falling asleep, congratulations, you're in rare company. Leave a comment and let us know, though we'll understand if you were snoring halfway through the eel pies.